Let's talk about gesso. This is white gesso, which is what most people are talking about when they talk about gesso. And gesso is a canvas primer. It's not a paint, even though it looks like a paint. It's a primer, and that means that it's meant to prime the surface to absorb something else. And generally what it's meant to absorb is acrylics or other paints or mediums that go on top. So it's very dense. It's very generally has a lot of white pigment in it, and it has some other stuff in it that gives it a little bit of tooth or a little bit of texture, which makes it grab onto the paints that you layer over on top of it. One of the questions that I am asked most often at the beginning of every one of my classes is, can I substitute white acrylic for white gesso? And the answer is no. Acrylic paint is meant to dry with a sort of plastic surface on the top. It's very slick, and it's not designed to grab onto other mediums. So if you layer paint on top of paint, chances are you'll be successful. But if you layer something else on top of the paint, you might get a little slide where you put something down and it actually floats across the surface of the paint. Gesso won't do that. Gesso will grab onto whatever you put on top of it and hold it down. So think of this as primer, just like spray paint. You have that gray, ugly gray primer. That's what gesso is for mixed media artists. So it comes in white, but it also comes in colors. This is black gesso, and in the same way that white gesso is very white, black gesso is very black. And this is fun to have if you do a lot of dark work, or if you want to work dark to light. I love black gesso, and I have several containers of it. This is the one that I've been using for a while. It came to me sort of exploded like this, but you can see how dark and dense it is. And like white gesso, it is a primer, so you can use it to sort of create a blackout on your page or on your surface, but then you can also use it as a primer to grab onto other media. So I like to do black gesso and then pastels on top of it or pencils on top of it, and it really grabs onto whatever I'm putting on top of it, and you get a nice bright color even though the background is black. And then there's also clear gesso, which, just like it sounds, it's clear. It looks like matte medium. Goes on white. Looks kind of like liquid matte medium. And it has all the grabbing properties without any of the priming properties. So if you lay this down, say on cardboard, like I am right now, you're getting all of the grabbing properties of the white gesso without the coverage. So the cardboard will shine through, but rather than your acrylic paints being sucked into the cardboard, you'll end up with paint that floats on the clear gesso and is grabbed onto by the tooth in the gesso. So instead of, I don't know, cardboard or wood sucking the paint into it, I don't know if you've experienced that, but it's a horrible thing. You end up using a ton of paint just to get a base coat down or whatever. Gesso will fix that problem right up. Just lay down a coat of clear gesso, and then you'll still have the color of the wood or the color of the cardboard, and you can paint on top of it and nobody will ever know that you're not having that black hole effect where it sucks up all of your paint. What do you do with gesso? Well, this is a piece of watercolor paper that has been primed with a coat of white gesso. And I know this is white on white, so you can't really see it. But I've primed it because I know that I'm going to do some layers of acrylic on top of it. And this way, the paper won't absorb my paint. It'll just float on the gesso, and the gesso will grab onto it. And that way I can use really light layers of paint to build up my layers. This is an altered book that has been primed with gesso, and you can see that I've used such a light coat of it that you can actually see the text through it. And that's one of the things I like about gesso. You can use just a tiny bit and put it on really thin. And this page has a considerable amount of tooth to it that the original pages really didn't have. These pages are kind of slick to the touch, and this makes them more receptive to paint and other media that I might put on top of it. So here's a piece of cardboard that I'm going to prime, and I chose cardboard because you can see what I'm doing. And I generally start priming by just pouring a tiny bit of gesso onto the surface. I don't bother with a paint palette because I don't want to waste any. And I generally try to put enough gesso to cover my surface, but not so much that I need to move any of it off or get rid of any of it, if that makes sense. So better too little than too much. And I'm using a foam makeup sponge to do this layer. It moves paint around much faster than a brush. It's not particularly absorbent. This is a latex sponge, and it's meant to not be absorbent so that it doesn't absorb makeup. It just floats the liquid on the surface, and that makes it great for moving paint around because there's very little waste. And I just get these little wedges at the dollar store, or they're sold wherever makeup is sold. And they're just makeup wedges. So there's my coat of gesso, and I'm not trying to cover the cardboard color completely. I just want to get a nice even coat on there. And generally I like it when it's a little bit uneven, because I know I'm going to build layers up on top of this. And this is sort of my first layer of texture. So rather than putting one flat layer of completely even gesso on here, I'm going to let it be a little uneven and let that be the first layer of many layers of texture. Another thing you can do with gesso is blend many layers into something more cohesive. So here I have a bunch of little scraps that I glued to my gessoed cardboard, and they're all sort of all different colors and all over the place. And I'm just going to apply a very light coat of gesso to this whole thing to sort of pull them all together, mute them down a little bit, and also to give them the same receptive surface as the areas that don't have the paper glued to them. And this way, as I build up my next layer, if it's paint or stenciling or whatever, the paint will go on the same way on the printed papers as it did on the background. So, and even doing just that much sort of pulls it together and makes it one sort of cohesive layer rather than a bunch of random pieces of paper glued to a background. And in doing this, you can gesso a little more maybe in some areas and a little less in others. If this orange is too punchy, I can gesso it down just a little bit. To sort of bring it into the same world as the rest of the pieces. And now I have one layer that's sort of unified that can now be built on with, I don't know, whatever my next layer will be.